The open source initiative claims to be the ultimate power in all the land when it comes to open source. If you want to have a software license that you say is an open source software license, the open source initiative says you have to go through them. You must get their blessing and approval to simply say this license is open source. But here's a fun little secret. The open source initiative has absolutely no control over the phrase open source, but that hasn't stopped them from trying. The path that they have taken to get to here, where they have no control over open source whatsoever, is a wild one. The story is incredibly dramatic. Failed trademark applications, trademark disputes, threats, lies, false histories. It's crazy. We're going to go through all of it right now because it's nuts. And this all really started for me because I had a question. Why does the open source initiative and many individuals related to the open source initiative and who like the open source initiative, why do those people so passionately defend a false history of the phrase open source? It's been a curious thing in my mind. It's been bouncing around like ping pong balls for many years now, because the reality is, the open source initiative has been pushing rather intensely a story about how the phrase open source was even created. They say that it was created in 1998 by Christine Peterson, and they have a direct link to that creation. And no one before that time ever used the phrase open source, and they didn't even know about the ideas of open source. And the crazy thing is, for those of us around in the early to mid 1990s, before this fabled 1998 date, we all remember open source. We remember open source software. We remember the phrase open source being used. We remember it being used in context, just like we use it nowadays. And in fact, if you go and look back in time, there are corporate press releases talking about open source software and articles from computer magazines and Usenet posts and all sorts of manner of stuff. I mean, it's obvious that the phrase open source had been around for years and years, if not decades, prior to when the open source initiative says it magically sprouted out of one person's head like an amazing unicorn in 1998. So yesterday I talked about this with Eric Raymond, who was a person that was in the room in 1998 when he says it was created, it was invented out of thin air. And he and I disagreed on this topic. But the disagreement isn't so startling. I've disagreed with people about this particular bit of history before. What really got me thinking is, what is it exactly that causes so many people to so passionately cling to the idea that the phrase open source did not exist prior to 1998? What a strange thing to cling to when there's thousands plus of records from magazines and everything else go look in the Internet Archive. It's crazy. Go look at Usenet. It's the amount of material that shows that phrase open source was used in context prior to 1990 is so overwhelming. It's ridiculous. So why try to push a false narrative for years, for decades? Well, to tell that story, we got to go back close to the beginning here. And we're going to go back to something called software in the public interest. Software in the public interest was an incorporated entity, a corporation that was really the corporation behind Debian. I don't know if many of you remember this, but at the time, Debian was part of the software in the public interest, which included a gentleman named Bruce Perens, who went on to found the open source initiative. Well, Bruce Perens, who went on to found the open source initiative, he filed a trademark application for the phrase open source. I'm going to read it to you now. This is from a statement in November of 1998 from Software in the Public Interest. I'm just going to read this to you now because it's a good history to know about. The open source trademark. The open source trademark was registered in the Software in the Public Interest name by Bruce Perens in February of 1998, anticipating the wider role that would be agreed for software in the public interest. Since then, the mark has been managed by Eric Raymond. Now, according to Bruce and Eric, on the 20th of March, 1998, Bruce sent Eric an email which claimed that, quote, software in the public interest hereby transfers all interest in the open source trademark to Eric Raymond. This message did not follow a board resolution to this effect, and indeed, at least one other board member was not aware of its existence until it was forwarded back to the current board by Eric Raymond during the current dispute. It is not the view of the current software in the public interest board that this email has any legal validity, and it was sent without approval of the board. Shortly following their resignation from the board of the software of the public interest, the former board members, which included Bruce Perens, moved to set up a new organization, the Open Source Initiative, which they are currently in the process of incorporating. Since this time, Bruce Perens has repeatedly demanded the immediate transfer of the open source trademark to this new organization. More on that in a moment, because this is nuts. The Software in the Public Interest Board engaged in discussions with Eric Raymond regarding the future of the mark. After some discussions during which the new Software in the Public Interest Board stated that we don't believe we have all the paperwork and expressed our reservations about the new open source initiative organization, Eric became convinced that Software in the Public Interest was failing to honor its promise to transfer the mark to him, and also demanded its immediate transfer to OSI. Lots of demands flying around. So back in 98, basically people broke off from the Software in the Public Interest, created the Open Source Initiative, and started issuing demands at the former organization. The Software in the Public Interest Board maintained that, at least at the moment, the SPI is a more open, accountable, and transparent organization than the Open Source Initiative. Now, here's an interesting thing. You can look up all the trademarks. So they're talking about trademarks being filed, people being maintainers and stewards over those trademarks. But if you look up using the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the trademark for open source as it relates to software, because there are a lot of people who attempted to trademark open source for a million different things, not related to software. It's all over the map. But if you check it out related to software, you will find that the application was rejected. It was rejected. It was declared abandoned on March 18th, 1999. It was filed on February 24th, 1998. It is labeled as dead. Application refused, dismissed, or invalidated. The trademark application was refused, dismissed, or invalidated by the office, and this application is no longer valid. So there is not now, nor has there ever been in history a trademark for open source as it relates to software. Nobody, not a single person, not a single entity has any control or has ever had control over the phrase open source, not in any way, shape, or form. Now, that hasn't stopped people from claiming control of it. You can see here, if you go to archive.org and look at the Open Source Initiative's open source definition from back in 1999, after the trademark application was expired and declared dead, quote, any software that uses licenses that are certified conformant to the open source definition, as defined by the Open Source Initiative, may use the open source trademark, as may source code explicitly placed in the public domain. No other license or software is certified to use the open source trademark, and the Open Source Initiative tried to enforce this quite a lot, quite heavy-handedly for quite some time, but they never, not for 1 second of one day, actually had an open source trademark. Not for a bit. And what's interesting here is the Software in the Public Interest kind of had the same thing going on. As late as sometime in the year 2000, the Software in the Public Interest declared that the open source trademark is managed by Eric Raymond on behalf of the free software community, end quote. None of that is true. It was not managed by Eric Raymond because it did not exist. It had been fully rejected. Now, here's some crazy stuff. We're going to go through things as best we can, roughly chronologically here. While all this was going on, while Bruce Perens and Eric Raymond had gone off and started working on founding the Open Source Initiative, while the Software in the Public Interest and the Open Source Initiative were fighting over who gets the trademark for open source, which neither of them had, there was weird, crazy drama going on behind the scenes. On April 5th of 1999, Bruce Perens, who drafted the open source definition and was one of the founders of the Open Source Initiative with Eric Raymond, posted the following to the Debian Linux email list. And the subject line simply said, "Email threat." Quote, "Today I received the following threat in email from Eric Raymond. The message was copied to the Silicon Valley Linux Users Group officers, who you may consult regarding its authenticity. The police have been notified. Because I know that Eric is a firearms enthusiast, for my own protection, I feel the best strategy is for me to publicize the threat widely. Thanks, Bruce Perens." Here is the email that Eric Raymond sent to Bruce Perens. Quote, "Damn straight I took it personally, and if you ever again behave like that kind of disrupted beep hole in public, insult me, and jeopardize the interest of our entire tribe, I'll take it just as personally, and I will find a way to make you regret it. Watch your step." The next day, April 6th of 1999, email threat withdrawn. Quote, "Eric says he only meant to threaten me with defamation of character, not with any kind of violence. Thus, I think I'll just let this issue drop now. Thanks, Bruce." There was all sorts of drama. There was so much drama and infighting back during 1999 and thereabouts relating to the open source initiative, the software in the public interest, and the ownership of the phrase open source. Tons of fighting, anger, massive amounts of anger, which led to this announcement. Now, there was an article. I should preface this. It'll talk about it in this announcement. But there was an article on June 15th, 1999, published by ZDNet. Up until that point, everyone seemed to think, was led to believe publicly, that somebody had a trademark on open source. Right? That's what the public thought. Whether that's what people actually thought at the Open Source Initiative or the software of the public interest is an unknown. They should have known there was no trademark, right? Because it was filed by Bruce Perens on behalf of the software in the public interest. And yeah, it didn't go anywhere. It failed and for very clear and obvious reasons. But this was the first moment, this June 15th ZDNet article back in 1999. This was the first time when the public suddenly became aware there was no trademark to open source. Not at all. Which prompted an immediate response from the Open Source Initiative, from Eric Raymond, who was leading the Open Source Initiative at the time. I'm going to read you the whole announcement from back in 1999 right now. And again, this is from, just make sure I got the date right. Yeah, June 16th of 1999. June 15th, 1999, ZDNet broke the news that OSI's application for an open source trademark had lapsed. Anticipating the public statement OSI had planned to make following its board meeting on the 17th of June. Subsequently, many people have expressed concern that the phrase open source might be trademarked by some party hostile to the open source community. Now, I think something that's really important here is this is June of 99. If we go back here, it was beginning of March, mid-March, March 18th, 1999, it was already officially like dead. And at that point, nothing had been granted. It was just under review, but it was fully dead as of March of 1999. All right, we continue. That's not likely. For the very reason the application was permitted to lapse. We have discovered that there is virtually no chance that the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office would register the mark open source. The mark is too descriptive. Ironically, we were partly a victim of our own success in bringing the open source concept into the mainstream. Now, that's kind of interesting because it was already in mainstream usage prior to 1998 and prior to the open source initiative existing at all. But they can take all the credit for it they want. He continues. So open source is not and cannot become a trademark. The purposes for which OSI sought a trademark, however, are still valid. We believe the open source community gains much from the existence of a recognizable brand name, one which certifies to users that software is being distributed under the licensing model best known to produce high-quality software. We believe that software vendors will seek to use an appropriate certification mark to signify that quality. For this reason, the Open Source Initiative is announcing a new certification mark, OSI Certified. When the Open Source Initiative has approved the license under which a software product is certified, the software's vendor is permitted to use the OSI Certified certification mark for that open source software. The details will be spelled out on OSI's website shortly. Now, I'm going to get into the OSI certified thing in a minute because, yeah, looking that one up on the Trademark Office yields some fun results. In all such decisions, OSI will seek, as it always has, to advance the interests of the community we serve and to promote the winning combination of open standards, open source code, and independent peer review. Because the phrase open source cannot be trademarked, we must rely on market pressure to protect the concept from abuse. When you see software that claims to be open source, look for the OSI certified mark as your assurance of compliance with acceptable licensing standards. If you do not see the OSI certified mark, please read the vendor's license for yourself to check that it is in conformance with the open source definition. Please encourage software providers to obtain OSI certification and to use the OSI certified mark, and do not purchase software if it claims to be open source but does not meet the terms of the OSD. The open source definition, this is from the Board of Directors of OSI and Eric Raymond on June 16th, 1999. And let's look this up real quick. OSI certified. That was in 1999. The Open Source Initiative did not get around to filing for application for about a year. The OSI certified was not even applied for a year. They announced it. The certification mark, this trademark certification mark in 1999, they didn't apply for it until 2000, and it's dead. It never was provided. It was never a thing. The trademark application was refused, dismissed, or invalidated by the office, and the application is no longer active. Official abandonment date is August 23rd, 2002. So it just kind of languished for a while and then fully died. Now, the Open Source Initiative does have some trademarks, so it's not like they don't know how to trademark things. They have the Open Source Initiative trademark, which they applied for in 2008, it was published in 2008 very promptly because it was a very simple trademark matter. And they also created something a few years later called the Open Source Initiative Approved License, which is sort of like the certified thing. And they came up with that in 2006, and they got a trademark for that one. But here's a fun little tidbit. If you look up the Patent and Trademark, or the Patent and Trademark Office paperwork for the Open Source Initiative's trademark, their service mark, and you look down at the bottom there, the very bottom of the page, I've got it on screen now. I want to make it clear that this had to be called out because it was such an important tidbit. Quote, no claim is made to the exclusive right to use, quote, open source, end quote, apart from the mark as shown. So basically meaning that the Open Source Initiative has absolutely no claim or right to use the phrase open source unless they use the word initiative after it. They can call themselves the Open Source Initiative, but they can't call themselves open source. They can't declare that they have any sort of ownership or control over open source whatsoever. Now that hasn't stopped them over the years. They have attacked a wide variety of licenses and whatnot, declaring that they're not open source, even though they have no control over that phrase at all. Now, an extra interesting tidbit of all this: both Bruce Perens and Eric Raymond are banned from the open source initiative. The guys that created the open source initiative, the guys that apparently there was a police call between Bruce Perens called the police on Eric Raymond at one point because he felt like Eric threatened to kill him, I guess. All sorts of stuff. But in 2005, the open source initiative said that Bruce Perens cannot become a member. Not a board of directors person, not an executive director, no fancy title. He's not allowed to be an average paying member that anyone can become. They rejected. He's like one of the only human beings on earth that is rejected from the open source initiative. One of the other ones is Eric Raymond, the other guy that created it. And that rejection is so extreme, they don't even allow Eric Raymond on their email lists at all. He's just fully banned from having any involvement with the open source initiative in any way, shape, or form. Which brings us to now. Brings us to 2025. The open source initiative is continuing to try and put forth a strong-armed view of they control what open source is. But here's the thing. Even they have to admit that absolutely nobody owns the phrase open source. No one has trademarked it, not ever. No one has any claim to its trademark, and lawyers, the trademark office, and they themselves have all agreed that the term open source is far too generic to be trademarked, and it was in common usage before any of the entities trying to trademark it ever even existed. Right? 1998, 1999 with the open source initiative and whatnot. Years prior to them existing, the open source phrase was already in common English language usage in the United States, specifically referring to it in the open source code of computer software, just like it is referred to today. Right? So they agree it cannot be trademarked. So they don't own it. They have no control over it whatsoever. But that didn't stop them. Both the software in the public interest and the open source initiative tried hard and failed to own that trademark. They felt like it was one of the most important things to them was to have it trademarked and have total control over usage of the phrase. You'll note when you go back and look through the documents, which we showed you some of here, that the open source initiative made it very clear that you were not allowed to use the phrase open source without first adhering to their requirements and getting approval from open source. They made it very clear. They stated it in the open source definition as far back as 1999. Now, they've since had to remove that because they don't have any such trademark. But they wanted it. They wanted that absolute power over just the usage of a simple phrase that they did not create. And to this day, and this is what really brought this topic up for me, to this day, the open source initiative continues to promote a false history of open source. Not just the word, but the idea itself. They continue to push these false narratives that are completely made up. And I like to laser in and focus on just the usage of the phrase open source in context when talking about, open source computer software and computer code. Because it's very simple to prove, right? We're not talking about a thought or an idea. We're talking about a simple phrase in common English usage: open source software, open source code. And it was in such common usage that it seems almost absurd that an organization would fight against that they would try to cover up that history. So why would an organization try to cover up that history? And my inclination, based on the understanding of the open source initiative's history, and we went through a little bit of it here today, is that it appears that the open source initiative and people involved with it currently, people involved with it then, and people who just simply are supportive of that organization have pushed that false history in an apparent attempt to bolster a claim of ownership of the phrase. Now, they've admitted at this point that they can't trademark it. They can't. But perhaps they want to do the next best thing, is convince people that they for all intents and purposes it's trademarked, right? It's not officially trademarked, but like they own it anyway, right? That seems to be the narrative that they've been pushing. They are attempting to bolster their claim of ownership of a common English phrase. It's fascinating that they would push that. They have a lot of emotion tied to it. And I think it also gets to the heart of their business model. If the open source initiative does not have full ownership of the phrase open source and the concept of open source, and they don't, then why would any organization give them money? Why would people become paying members of that organization when they don't have any control over open source whatsoever? And so I think they have to continue to bolster that claim of ownership of not just the idea, but the origination of the phrase itself in order to keep that money train rolling in. And I think a lot of people have tied a lot of their self-worth to that phrase, to this claim that it was created at this magical point in time. A meteor landed and poof, out popped the open source initiative in 1998. This weird story. And I think so many people have made that part of their identity, almost of their own personal histories. And I think Eric Raymond is one of them that they defend it at all costs, even when it's nonsensical, even when even just simple details from the U.S. Patent Trademark Office dispute the narrative. The magazines dispute it. Usenet posts dispute it. There's almost no reason to believe that this phrase was created in 1998, other than the people who desperately want you to think that say it a lot, over and over again. And that's it. It's a myth. It's a myth, but it's fascinating. The story, this crazy tumultuous story with threats and trademark disputes and police being called and outright lies and just craziness that got us to the point where we're at today. And I think a lot of people out there still believe that the open source initiative controls open source, the phrase open source. Some people even think that they have the trademark for open source because it was repeated so many times over so many years. None of it's true. Thank you for bearing with me as we go through this, because getting history right is important, no matter what side you fall on ideologically of closed source, free software, open source, public domain software, whatever you think of software licensing. It almost doesn't matter when we're talking about the history of it all. We get the history right, and then we can all have our own opinions on what kind of licensing is better and who did a good job or a bad job of pushing the licensing, blah, blah, blah. We can get to all that after the fact. But unless we can all understand what the actual history is, everything else is built on a house of lies. The foundation of all discussions of open source and everything that comes after it has to be built on top of a bedrock of what is the history of open source. What is the history of the phrase open source, the trademarks of open source, the organizations who make the open source licenses, the open source definition, all of it. We have to understand the history. And so this is an attempt at that. Thank you to Lunduke Journal subscribers. Go to lunduke.com and start clicking on things. There are links there that are going to blow your friggin' mind. You can watch and listen to the Lunduke Journal everywhere. Support us everywhere. For the rest of the month of February, you can get a huge discount on subscriptions, including lifetime subscriptions. It's amazing. You love it. Lunduke.com. And with that, boys and girls, nerd, I'm going to get yelled at for this show. It's crazy. This show isn't political in any way at all. It's just historical about a word, a phrase, a two-word phrase. That's all this is, where I talk about like Here's screenshots from the patent office. It should be the most like boring show on earth, right? It should be something that, okay, we just go, okay, well, that's history. Yeah, well, there's all the documents. There they are. Done. And we just move on. That's not what's going to happen. I'm going to get yelled at. And that's fine. What are you going to do? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.